From a director who didn't know he was remaking a classic, to a football star who wanted the director's chair, to Pam Grier's shocking lion death scene, Hitman's production was as wild as its violent revenge plot, packed with improvised dialogue, moral outrage, and career-launching moments you'd never expect. Fact 1. Director didn't know he was remaking. Get Carter. George Armitage had one of the strangest directing experiences in Hollywood history when he signed on to make Hitman in 1972. According to Armitage himself, producer Gene Corman approached him with a screenplay that had no title page and asked him to rewrite it specifically for a black cast. Armitage dove into the project, working on the script and preparing for production without knowing anything about its origins. He assumed it was an original screenplay that Corman had commissioned, and he focused all his energy on adapting the story to fit the blaxploitation genre that was exploding in popularity at the time. It wasn't until after he had finished the rewrite and was deep into pre-production that his agent casually mentioned something that stopped him cold. The script he'd been working on was actually Get Carter, the British crime thriller that had been released just 1 year earlier, starring Michael Caine. Armitage was stunned to discover he'd unknowingly been remaking a film that was still playing in some theaters. The revelation came so late in the process that there was no turning back, and the production moved forward with Armitage at the helm. This bizarre situation meant that Armitage approached the material with fresh eyes, not trying to copy or improve upon Mike Hodges' original direction, but instead treating it as if it were a completely new story. Some film historians believe this accidental ignorance actually helped the film stand on its own, rather than becoming a slavish remake, allowing Armitage to bring his own sensibilities to the material without the burden of comparison weighing on his creative choices during the crucial development phase. Fact 2. Bernie Casey wanted to direct, but was refused. Behind the scenes of Hitman, there was a significant creative conflict that nearly derailed the entire production before cameras ever rolled. Bernie Casey, the former NFL star who was cast in the lead role, had ambitions that went far beyond just acting in the film. Casey actively wanted to direct Hitman himself, seeing it as an opportunity to step behind the camera and tell a story from his own perspective. What makes this situation even more interesting is that George Armitage, the white director who was ultimately hired for the job, actually agreed with Casey and campaigned hard for the studio to give Casey the director's chair. Armitage felt strongly that Casey deserved the chance and would bring an authenticity to the material that would elevate the entire project. However, producer Gene Corman flatly refused to take what he considered a risk on an unproven director. Casey had no directing experience at the time, and Corman wasn't willing to gamble on a debut director for a film that needed to be made quickly and efficiently on a tight budget. This created an awkward tension on set, where the star wanted the job of the man who was actually directing him, and that director openly admitted he thought the star should have gotten the position instead. Despite this uncomfortable dynamic, both men maintained a professional relationship throughout filming. Casey channeled his frustrations into his performance, while Armitage tried to give Casey as much creative input as possible on his character's development and the film's overall approach to storytelling within the blaxploitation framework. Fact 3. The lead star was an NFL Pro Bowler. Bernie Casey brought a unique athletic pedigree to the lead role in Hitman that was unlike almost any other actor working in Hollywood at the time. Before he ever stepped in front of a camera, Casey was a legitimate NFL star who played wide receiver for the Los Angeles Rams and the San Francisco 49ers. He wasn't just a journeyman player either. Casey was selected to the Pro Bowl and was considered one of the premier receivers in professional football during his era. What makes his transition to acting even more remarkable is that Casey walked away from football at age 30, which was still the prime of his athletic career by any measure. While most players at that age are fighting to squeeze out a few more seasons before their bodies give out, Casey voluntarily retired to pursue what many people thought was a pipe dream. He wanted to become a professional actor, painter, and poet, dedicating himself to the arts full-time instead of continuing to make good money playing a game he'd already mastered. This decision shocked people in the sports world who couldn't understand why someone would abandon financial security and fame for such uncertain artistic pursuits. But Casey was serious about his passion for creativity and expression. By the time he landed the role in Hitman, he had already appeared in several smaller films and was determined to prove he could be a leading man, not just a former athlete trying to extend his 15 minutes of fame by capitalizing on name recognition from sports. Fact 4. Most dialogue was completely improvised. One of the most distinctive elements of Hitman's production was George Armitage's unconventional approach to the script and how scenes would actually play out on camera. Rather than insisting that actors stick rigidly to the written dialogue, Armitage actively encouraged the entire cast to throw out the scripted lines and improvise the bulk of their conversations. This wasn't just limited to small throwaway moments or background chatter. The improvisational approach extended to major scenes and important plot points throughout the film. Armitage believed that having the predominantly black cast speak in their own authentic voices would create a much more realistic and powerful film than having them recite dialogue written by screenwriters who might not fully understand the rhythms and patterns of speech within the African American community. He wanted the characters to sound like real people having real conversations, not actors performing lines that felt artificial or forced. The actors embraced this freedom enthusiastically, bringing their own experiences, speech patterns, and cultural references into their performances. They could react naturally to each other rather than waiting for specific cue lines, and they could adjust their language based on who their character was talking to and what the emotional stakes of the scene required. This approach gave Hitman a documentary-like quality in many scenes where the dialogue feels spontaneous and lived in rather than theatrical. While some of the core plot information obviously had to be communicated to move the story forward, the way characters expressed those ideas came directly from the actors themselves, making the film feel grounded in a specific time, place, and community. Fact 5. Pam Grier did it as a favor. Pam Grier's involvement in Hitman is interesting for what it reveals about the behind-the-scenes relationships and the precarious position Bernie Casey found himself in as he tried to establish a career in Hollywood. Despite receiving second billing in the film's credits, which would suggest a substantial role, Grier actually appears in relatively few scenes, and her character doesn't drive the main plot. According to reports from the production, Grier agreed to take this small supporting role primarily as a favor to Bernie Casey, who was struggling to get his career as a leading man off the ground. At this point in 1972, Grier was already becoming the undisputed queen of blaxploitation cinema, with starring roles in films that showcased her as a tough, commanding presence who could carry an entire movie on her shoulders. She had the leverage to be selective about her projects and demand substantial roles. Casey, on the other hand, was still trying to prove he was more than just a former football player dabbling in acting. He needed credibility, and having someone with Grier's growing star power attached to the project gave Hitman a legitimacy it might not have otherwise had. Grier's participation helped secure financing and distribution, and her name on the poster would draw audiences who might otherwise skip a film starring an unproven leading man. This kind of favor was common in the tight-knit community of black actors working in exploitation films during this era, where actors often helped each other get projects made in an industry that gave them limited opportunities. Fact 6. Pam Grier's character gets mauled by a lion hitman contains one of the most shocking and disturbing death scenes in blaxploitation cinema history, and it involves Pam Grier's character meeting an absolutely brutal end. In the film, Grier plays Gozelda, a woman who becomes a target of the protagonist's revenge mission. Rather than being shot, stabbed, or killed in any of the conventional ways that characters typically die in crime films, Gozelda suffers a fate that is both unexpected and genuinely horrifying to watch. The character is released into a wildlife preserve, presumably to face justice through exile, or to be left to survive on her own in the wilderness. However, within moments of being let loose in this supposed sanctuary, Gozelda is attacked by a lion that mauls her to death while the audience watches. The scene is startling not just because of its violence, but because of how unusual it is. Using a wild animal as an instrument of revenge in an urban crime drama feels like it belongs in a completely different genre of film. The filmmakers clearly wanted to create a death that audiences would remember and talk about long after leaving the theater, and they succeeded in that goal. The scene sparked significant discussion and controversy, with some viewers finding it gratuitously violent and others appreciating it as a bold creative choice that set Hitman apart from other revenge thrillers. For Pam Grier, whose star was rising rapidly at this point, it meant her limited screen time in the film would be memorable for all the wrong reasons, cementing this as one of the strangest roles in her extensive filmography. Fact 7. Condemned with a Marquis de Sade reference. Hitman attracted the attention of moral watchdog groups almost immediately upon its release, but the condemnation it received from the National Legion of Decency went far beyond the typical complaints about violence and sexuality in exploitation films. The organization issued a scathing review that described Hitman as a dizzying spectacle of raw sex and super-graphic violence that would horrify the Marquis de Sade. This was an extraordinary comparison for a moral advocacy group to make, invoking the name of the infamous French nobleman whose writings about extreme sexual violence and philosophical libertinism made him one of history's most notorious figures. The Marquis de Sade spent much of his life imprisoned for his crimes and writings, and his name became synonymous with sadism itself. For the National Legion of Decency to suggest that even the Marquis de Sade would be appalled by Hitman was meant to convey that the film had crossed every possible line of decency and ventured into territory that went beyond mere bad taste into something genuinely obscene. The statement was clearly designed to be inflammatory and to discourage people from seeing the film by suggesting it contained content so extreme that even someone celebrated for extremity would find it disturbing. Of course, this kind of condemnation often had the opposite effect, as curious audiences wanted to see exactly what could be so shocking that it warranted comparison to one of history's most infamous figures. The review became part of the film's marketing in an indirect way, giving it a dangerous reputation that actually helped draw crowds. Fact 8. Future fugitive director shot the film. The cinematographer behind the camera on Hitman was a young talent named Andrew Davis, who was still early in his career and taking any job he could get to build his resume and learn the craft of filmmaking. At the time, Davis was unknown and working on low-budget exploitation films because that's where the opportunities existed for someone trying to break into the industry. Fast forward 2 decades, and Andrew Davis became one of Hollywood's most successful action directors, helming major blockbusters that defined the 1990s thriller genre. He directed The Fugitive, the Harrison Ford vehicle that became a massive critical and commercial success, earning 7 Academy Award nominations and winning 1 for Tommy Lee Jones's supporting performance. Davis also directed Under Siege, the Steven Seagal action film that became one of the biggest hits of 1992 and spawned a sequel. Looking back at Hitman through the lens of Davis's later career success is fascinating because you can see the seeds of his visual style already developing in this early work. Even on the severely limited budget of a blaxploitation film, Davis demonstrated an understanding of how to frame action sequences and use camera movement to create energy and momentum. His work on Hitman shows someone who understood the mechanics of visual storytelling and knew how to make the most of limited resources, skills that would serve him incredibly well when he eventually got the chance to work with major studio budgets and A-list stars on films that would be seen by millions. Fact 9. Gene Corman's second blaxploitation remake formula producer. Gene Corman, the younger brother of legendary B-movie king Roger Corman, developed a very specific formula for creating blaxploitation films that would prove successful in the early 1970s marketplace. Hitman was actually his second film following this particular blueprint, which involved taking existing MGM properties that had already been filmed and remaking them with predominantly black casts for black audiences who were hungry for films that featured actors who looked like them in leading roles. His first experiment with this approach was Cool Breeze, released in 1972, which was a remake of The Asphalt Jungle, the classic 1950 heist film directed by John Huston. When Cool Breeze performed reasonably well at the box office, Corman knew he had found a sustainable model that could keep generating content. The genius of this approach was that it solved one of the biggest challenges in low-budget filmmaking: finding good source material. By licensing properties that MGM already owned and that had proven story structures, Corman could skip the development process and move straight into production with screenplays that already worked. The fact that these were remakes didn't matter to the target audience, because most black moviegoers in 1972 had never seen the original versions of these films, which had been made decades earlier with all-white casts and weren't marketed to black communities. This meant Corman could present these stories as if they were fresh and original while actually working from tested blueprints, giving him a significant advantage over producers who were trying to develop original material from scratch. Fact 10. UK censors cut the dogfighting scene. When Hitman was released in the United Kingdom, it immediately ran into problems with the British Board of Film Classification, which is responsible for rating and sometimes censoring content that appears in films shown in British cinemas. The censors took particular issue with one specific sequence in the film that depicts illegal dogfighting, a practice that was and remains illegal in the United Kingdom due to animal cruelty laws. The scene features graphic footage of dogs violently attacking each other with visible blood on the animals as they fight, and the British censors determined that this content was not acceptable for public viewing under any circumstances. As a result, all versions of Hitman released in the UK were required to be cut by 36 seconds to completely remove the dogfighting footage. This wasn't a minor trim of a few frames to reduce the impact. The entire sequence had to be excised from the film, creating a noticeable gap in the narrative where the scene once existed. The decision reflected the UK's generally stricter approach to content involving animal cruelty compared to American standards, where such scenes might receive warnings but wouldn't necessarily be cut entirely. For British viewers who watched Hitman in theaters or later on home video, there's a jarring moment where the film suddenly jumps past what was clearly supposed to be an important scene, though most viewers probably didn't realize they were watching a censored version unless they specifically sought out information about the cuts. Fact 11. It follows the novel more faithfully than Get Carter. One of the most ironic aspects of Hitman being dismissed as simply a blaxploitation remake of Get Carter is that it actually follows the source material more closely than the film it's supposedly copying. Both Get Carter and Hitman are based on the same novel, Jack's Return Home, written by British author Ted Lewis and published in 1970. While Mike Hodges' Get Carter is now considered a classic of British crime cinema, it took significant liberties with Lewis' novel, particularly in how it ends. The most notable change in Get Carter is that the protagonist is killed at the end of the film, shot down on a beach in a bleak conclusion that emphasizes the futility of revenge and the impossibility of escaping the criminal underworld once you're part of it. However, this ending doesn't appear in Lewis's original novel, where Jack Carter actually survives his revenge mission. Hitman, despite changing the setting from northern England to urban America and altering character names and specific plot details to fit the blaxploitation genre, actually preserves the novel's ending and allows the protagonist to walk away alive after completing his mission of vengeance. This means that viewers who judge Hitman purely as a derivative remake of Get Carter are missing the fact that in some ways it's more faithful to what Ted Lewis originally wrote than the more famous British version. The decision to keep the protagonist alive also changes the film's entire moral framework, suggesting that revenge can be successfully achieved and that someone can emerge from violence relatively unscathed. Fact 12. The director felt a white man shouldn't direct it. George Armitage found himself in an ethically complicated position when he was offered the job of directing Hitman, and he didn't shy away from expressing his discomfort publicly, both during production and in subsequent interviews about the film. Armitage openly stated that he didn't believe a white director should be making a blaxploitation film, arguing that stories centered on black characters and the black experience should be told by black filmmakers who understood that experience from the inside, rather than observing it as outsiders. This was a remarkably self-aware and progressive position for a director to take in 1972, a time when the film industry was even less diverse than it is today, and when most white filmmakers didn't think twice about telling any kind of story regardless of the cultural background of the characters. According to Armitage, he only agreed to direct Hitman when he learned that the production was on the verge of being canceled entirely because the producers couldn't find a black director who was available and willing to take on the project under the tight timeline and budget constraints they were operating under. Armitage essentially saw his participation as a compromise that would allow the film to get made rather than dying in development hell. He reasoned that a flawed film that existed was better than a perfect film that never got produced. This internal conflict seems to have influenced his directorial approach, leading him to give the cast as much creative freedom as possible through improvisation. Fact 13. MGM had more faith in this than Get Carter. In one of the great ironies of cinema history, MGM completely misjudged which version of Jack's return home would become the enduring classic and which would fade into relative obscurity. When Get Carter was first released in 1971, MGM barely promoted it and showed little confidence that the gritty British crime film would find an audience, particularly in America, where British films often struggle to gain traction outside of major urban markets. The studio found the film too dark, too violent, and too specifically British to have broad commercial appeal. However, when they decided to produce Hitman just 1 year later, they believed they had a potential hit on their hands. The blaxploitation genre was exploding in popularity, with films like Shaft and Superfly proving that there was a massive, underserved audience eager to see black characters in leading roles in action-oriented stories. MGM executives convinced themselves that Hitman, with its contemporary American setting and its potential to tap into the same audience that made other blaxploitation films successful, would far outperform the British film that nobody seemed to care about. They put marketing resources behind Hitman that they never gave to Get Carter, creating posters and promotional materials designed to position it as a major release. Of course, history proved them spectacularly wrong. Get Carter went on to be recognized as one of the greatest British crime films ever made, while Hitman became a footnote, remembered primarily as a curiosity in the careers of its cast and crew. Fact 14. The cast reunited from another Corman film, Hitman, featured several actors who were already familiar with each other and with producer Gene Corman's working methods because they had recently collaborated on another film together. Pam Grier, Sam Laws, and Rudy Challenger all appeared in both Hitman and Cool Breeze, Corman's earlier blaxploitation remake of The Asphalt Jungle that had been released earlier in 1972. This wasn't accidental. Corman had developed a stable of reliable performers who understood the demands of low-budget exploitation filmmaking and could deliver strong performances quickly without requiring extensive rehearsal time or multiple takes that would slow down production. These actors knew how to hit their marks, deliver their lines with conviction, and bring energy to scenes even when shooting conditions were less than ideal, and budgets didn't allow for luxuries like extensive lighting setups or multiple camera angles. For the actors themselves, working repeatedly with the same producer meant steady employment in an industry where black performers often struggled to find work, and it allowed them to develop a rapport and shorthand that made the actual filming process more efficient and enjoyable. The reunion also meant that these actors were appearing in two of the first blaxploitation remakes of classic Hollywood properties within the same year, making them pioneers in a very specific subgenre that would prove to be short-lived but culturally significant. Their presence in both films helped establish a sense of continuity and shared universe for audiences who were following the emerging blaxploitation movement closely. Fact 15. Paul Gleason's uncredited early role. Eagle-eyed viewers watching Hitman carefully might notice a familiar face in a small role as a corrupt police officer, though they'll have to look closely because the actor isn't credited anywhere in the film's opening or closing titles. That uncredited performer is Paul Gleason, who would go on to become one of Hollywood's most recognizable character actors over the following 2 decades. Gleason is probably best known for playing Deputy Police Chief Dwayne Robinson, the officious and obstinate LAPD official who constantly clashes with Bruce Willis's John McClane in Die Hard, the 1988 action classic that redefined the genre. He also memorably played the authoritarian assistant principal Richard Vernon in The Breakfast Club, the John Hughes film where he supervises the detention that brings 5 very different high school students together. But in 1972, Gleason was just another struggling actor taking any work he could get, including small uncredited roles in low-budget exploitation films that needed bodies to fill out crowd scenes or play minor functionaries. His appearance in Hitman represents one of his earliest film roles, coming at a point in his career when he was still years away from the steady character work that would make him a familiar face to moviegoers. The fact that he went uncredited suggests either that he was working for scale pay as a favor or that his role was so minor that billing wasn't considered necessary or important enough to warrant a credit in the already crowded title sequence.